Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, Execution After Crisis, Shining a Light on Business Risk and Opportunities Through a Global Pandemic with Dr. Swanson, Wells Fargo's Chief Food and Agricultural Economist. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here with us this afternoon. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Stella Primo, and I'm the Executive Director of the Capital Region Family Business Center. The Family Business Center is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that started over a decade ago by family businesses interested in sharing resources and best practices on family business succession. Our mission is to help family businesses in our region to grow and prosper. And if you're not a member yet, please consider joining us and our outstanding network. This webinar is being recorded and will be included on our website at capfamilybus.org by the end of the day tomorrow. And I'll send you a follow-up email after this session with the link to the resources page and also to the website in general. We'll be using the Q&A button below. So if you have questions throughout the program, please use that dialog box to enter your questions, and then Dr. Swanson will be taking Q&A towards the end of the program. This presentation is for educational purposes only. Let me see if I can click the button. This presentation is for educational purposes only and not intended to be advice. So please contact your personal advisor for specific questions regarding your family business situation. Dr. Swanson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Stella. I really appreciate the opportunity to be talking to people. You know, first off, a little about who you're listening to and why should you listen to me, if at all. And that's a really good question. My wife sometimes asks that. I'm Mike Swanson. I'm originally from Minnesota, where I'm addressing you from today. My background is, came out of Western Minnesota, agricultural base. First job after college was with the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad in the grain division. Then went back to school, got my master's, and my missus, my wife, who's from Columbia, came up to study for her master's in agricultural economics, and she's very efficient. She got her master's and her misters all at the same time. We got married and moved to Columbia. And when I was in Columbia in the early 90s, I worked for Cargill for about 4 years as a grain trader. Went back to the University of Minnesota, finished my PhD in agricultural economics. Went to work for Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes, some people probably know, is a large national cooperative. They have their dairy manufacturing and crop input divisions. Then, I went to work for Wells Fargo for the last 20 years. So the last 20 years, I've been Wells Fargo's ag economist. And I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in California. I really enjoy being in the Central Valley and, Salinas, or down by Brawley. There's so much good ag in California. It's a great state. And so talking about, some of the things we're seeing with COVID right now and thinking about family businesses. So we put this presentation together, and one of the questions was, what did COVID really change, if anything? So Stella, if you don't mind going to the next slide. When I think about things, I always ask myself, what's the system? It's interesting, if you've ever had the fortune or the misfortune to study economics, and most people have, they're really big on equations. The teacher likes to get up, or the professor likes to get up and write an equation on the board that represents life. And then they do math and algebra to change the equation to illustrate something. But in reality, the world's a system. And systems are defined by the way that things interact. You change A, and A changes B, but that's not the end of the story. B turns around and changes A. That's what we call a feedback loop. And basically, in real worlds, there's always a feedback loop. There's always something coming around from what you did. So when you think about a system, there's two things you want to ask yourself when something happens. Is it a structural change? Did you change something? When you change something in the structure of a system, it's permanent. It changes the system permanently. What can be a structural change? Well, elimination of demand. I mean, the old stories about, buggy whips. You could be the world's best buggy whip maker, but there's no more horse and buggies, and so you're not going to have a good business. So elimination of demand, alternative technology. One area in agriculture is a big story right now is ethanol. Ethanol takes 40% of U.S. corn, but battery technology, as I tell the corn farmers of Minnesota and Illinois, is how much ethanol does a Tesla use? And the answer is none. So is there an alternative technology? How about regulatory change? Well, people, that's a big part of California's story. We know that. I love my friends out there in California, especially in the ag side. And I tell them, wow, it seems like you have a bad case of Sacramento. And unfortunately, regulatory change is a big deal. But then let's talk cyclical change. Cyclical change is one of those shocks that you would get, and it's transitory. It might make a big impact, but it will work its way through the system. But if it doesn't change the system, it's temporary. Supply and demand shocks, things like weather, we see it all the time in agriculture and other things. Currency or trade issues, weather events, interest rates. Well, maybe throw COVID in here. In some ways, COVID probably fits in both categories. They'll probably have some structural change. There's also probably cyclical change as well. So thinking about your business, which is a big part of anybody's financial situation, is sit down, take a piece of blank paper with a pencil or a pen, and just think about COVID and write down what do you think is a structural change from COVID, and what do you think is a cyclical change from COVID, and then think about what you might want to do. So still, if you go to the next slide here, you can ask about one of the points on the invite was cash and courage. Well, it's interesting when we think about some of the famous investors out there. One that's probably well known to everybody is Warren Buffett. And people always ask, well, what makes people like Warren Buffett successful? And one thing that I always take away from Warren Buffett's talks is you got to have cash and courage if you're going to be successful in business. So what we're looking at here is the S&P 500 stock index. And since I put this chart together, it shot up a little bit more, and then the last couple of days it's come down a little bit more. But this stock index really kind of shows two things. One is, I have a saying that nothing natural moves in a straight line. And if you look at this, yeah, it trends up over time, but it doesn't go there in a straight line. And the problem with a lot of forecasts is they're all straight lines. So they're wrong. You just don't know how they're wrong. And the other thing is, if you look at this, as I say to a lot of people, a lot of great fortunes were made when everybody else was running for the exits. But in order to do that, you needed to have cash available and courage. So as we think about COVID and as the way it works through the system today for all businesses, where's the opportunity? And do you have cash? Can you access cash? And do you have the courage to deploy it? Because if you did at the bottom of the market, you've already seen great returns. So it's one of those things where psychology is as important as the analytical skills. So let's go to the next slide, Stella, and talk a little bit about the economy. I always tell people what you see in the macroeconomy is simply a reflection of the microeconomy. And every business needs three things. You've never seen a business that doesn't have these three things. You have capital. Every business needs buildings, equipment, accounts, receivable, inventory, and how you divide that capital between debt and equity, that's a big question, especially with your banker. But tools in and of themselves aren't very useful unless they have labor. And labor without capital is pretty not very helpful either. I mean, you can have a lot of hands, but no tools, not much. So every company is a mixture of capital and labor. And we just need to understand that, because the other thing we got to remember from our economics class is the concept of substitutes and complements. I don't know if bringing back way back memories for people who are listening, but when you think about that, capital and labor are both complements. That means you need one and the other, but they're also substitutes. You can substitute capital for labor, and you can substitute labor for capital. And when you think about what's happening with COVID right now, at the moment, for probably a short period of time, we went from an extremely tight labor market where the biggest challenge we heard from every business that we ever talked to was, I can't find good employees at prevailing wages. You could always find employees, maybe they weren't good, You could always overpay to get employees, but finding good employees at prevailing wages was the struggle. And so with cheap capital available, it made a lot of sense to automate, to invest. And right now, for a short period of time at least, we know we'll have more employees available. So maybe that helps the thumb on the labor scale. But there's a third element that I don't think we do a good job addressing, and that's that management or technological change. And what we see over and over again, at least I do as I talk to so many businesses around the country, is are you good at changing the technology? Because technology just changes underneath our feet as we stand there. And are you good at knowing a change and then adapting it? And then how effective are you putting these combinations together? So as we're going through this, I think everybody should say, okay, capital, labor, technology / management. Where's my business at? What am I strong at with? What am I weak at? And if we're not honest, we don't have that piece of paper we're willing to put down our strengths and weaknesses, we're not going to do ourselves a lot of good to managing. So let's go to the next slide and think about the economy. Now, this slide comes from the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is the keeper of numbers in Washington, D.C. They're supposed to be a nonpartisan group, though I don't know if nonpartisan actually exists anymore in this world. And they say, okay, what do we expect for growth going forward? This is a snapshot from earlier this year, so they haven't put COVID into here yet. They haven't had a new update. But there's a couple of interesting things you can look at this chart over time. First, the height of each of those bars represents the real GDP growth during that period of time. Real means adjusted for inflation. So they're supposed to take inflation out of the numbers. And you can see that we have more or less GDP growth in different eras. But what's also interesting, if you think about it, is the contribution from the capital, the labor, and the productivity. So yes, US GDP growth has slowed over the last 20 years. We're expecting a pretty modest recovery pre-COVID, and I think they'll probably stick in that range when they put out the new numbers, because this is a 10-year outlook, it's not quarter. But what's really changed is most of the contribution for GDP growth comes from technology and capital. You look at the portion from hours worked or labor, and it's pretty minimal. And thinking about California in particular and businesses in California labor market was tight, and I'm going to predict it gets tight again. It's just the conditions are going to be difficult to find good labor at prevailing wages. And so I don't think this is going to change. I think when we think about businesses in aggregate, our opportunities are going to follow along the same lines. It's got to be about managing capital and technology. And so if that's what we're seeing in the general economy, probably a pretty good indication that we better be good at that if we're going to be successful in that economy. So Stella, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So talk a little bit here, and there's 2 points. Yeah, you bring those up. There's 2 points that everybody should think about. I mean, thank you. There's 2 points. You know, everybody thinks their business is unique, and it is to some degree. But it's interesting, you know, as a business economist or, you know, of the big bank, you see a lot of businesses in different segments, and they all have their linkages. You know, everybody faces the same interest rates, the same labor markets, you know, commodity prices. And all business segments have positive returns because they have to. But what we'll see in a couple of slides is that there's a big gap between what happens in any segments. And so the question is, do you know where you're at? Do you know how you're performing relative to your competition? And the other part, just like we're in the recession right now, we'll be coming out of the recession soon enough, is cycles are part of the world. And that ability to adapt is a big part of it. Now, the second point is something that it's hard to see sometimes because most business owners, operators, they're dealing with the hottest fire all the time. And that's not a criticism, it's just the way the world works. And it's true for Wells Fargo's management. You know, they're dealing with the hottest fire as well. We all would like to be strategic. We'd all like to be long-term thinkers, but it's really tough. And there's a huge gap in every single segment I've ever seen between strong and weak in terms of performance. And that gap drives a lot of behavior. For example, no one price gives everybody the same signal. We're going to talk a little bit about agriculture because that's kind of my world. In Central California has a lot of agriculture. But you can say a price, pick almonds. You can say, okay, almond prices are falling because we have a 3 billion pound crop on the horizon. We've had a couple of tough months getting product out the door, some trade disputes. Okay, so almond prices are dropping. But if you're an almond producer who's got, pick a number, 1,800 pounds of production per acre, and you have another one that's producing 3,200 pounds per acre, one has access to cheaper water than the other. Yeah, $1.80 almonds gives a very different signal. One is a huge loss, for other it might just be a break even. And there's all sorts of things that go into making a stronger, weaker performer, And the other thing is the only constant is change. And so we just need to know, we have to think about this as an ongoing adjustment process. And last point that I always say is, are you being honest about your strengths and weaknesses as a business? Because everybody can think of what they're good at, but if you're not addressing the weaknesses as well, then what are you going to fix? So let's go to the next slide here, Stella. And there's a couple of points, but there's one more. Thank you. Like I said, how can they think that? I don't think there's a single business operator that hasn't said at some point is, why do I have so many irrational competitors? Why don't they see the world and do something smarter than they're doing? Why are they selling it for that price? Why are they building a new factory right next door to my factory? Why are they, you think to yourself, why are they being irrational? Well, I don't think they're being irrational. Typically, mainly they have a different response. You look at businesses, they have different historical book values. We'll see this in a couple of slides. Leverage is a big driver. A lot of businesses have very different leverage levels. So in a crisis, a highly leveraged business that was flying a little while ago is suddenly, stalled and going down hard. Borrowing costs, and those are related oftentimes to the leverage and borrowing costs. Dividend needs. Talking to small businesses, dividend needs are a real issue. If you have multiple generations of ownership, if you have active membership, active owners versus non-active owners, dividend needs can be a big driver of why they do things differently. And those cycles, dealing with those cycles is a big part of it. So it's easy for me to sit here, and I know that, and one of the old challenges to economists is, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? Well, that's a good question, because easier said than done is a real business model. I work a lot with a lot of different ag producers, and it's interesting. One of my friends that I've gotten to know in dairy over the years told me a very interesting story. He's a very large producer here in the Midwest, and he told me back in the late 80s, he was going bankrupt. In fact, he was headed to bankruptcy court one morning, and as he's driving to the bankruptcy court, he said to himself, I wonder what the judge is going to tell me what I need to do here at bankruptcy court. And he thought about it, and he said, yeah. He got to the court, judge told him what he had to do, and he thought to himself, yeah, those are all things I should have done anyways. Talk to my manager, tell him he has to take a pay cut, or I can't have him employed. I have to, so he said, I learned a big lesson that day. He said, I learned I don't put off problems. He says, so every day I wake up, I say, what do I wish I could put off today? And then I don't do it. I go ahead and do it. It doesn't delay anymore. And then going back to thinking about systems, where's the problem? Is it out there or in here? For so many businesses, when you talk to them, and it's just human nature, you say, well, what's the challenge today? And as you start the conversation, say, oh, the price of almonds is too low, or, price of milk is too low, or, I can't find good employees. Yeah, that's true. But what are you going to do about it? Where is the focus? If your problem's out there, it's really difficult. So Stella, I want to go to the next slide here. And I'm going to illustrate some of these points, just finish up here and talk about agriculture and agribusiness. So let's go to the next slide and talk some of the money. Well, it's interesting because what you hear in the paper really isn't true. I know this is a shock to a lot of people, especially if you've ever had somebody write about your business, you wonder what they were seeing. But a couple of things are tough to change. One is demographics. And it's interesting when you think about it. In the United States, population growth continues to slow. We're going to expect this year to have probably the slowest population growth we've seen in 75 or 80 years. Probably going to clock in at about 0.5% or even slightly less. People are putting off starting families. People are putting off having more kids. Immigration has slowed down for a number of reasons. So, but that's true of the rest of the world. Right now, according to the United Nations, in agriculture, and we're all about feeding people, global population growth is 1.1%. That's the lowest number that they have in their 70-year time horizon. And most of the growth is in areas like Africa. Now, the good news is that urbanization is continuing because urbanization in areas like Africa and Asia leads to higher incomes and better food consumption. So there's some trends that are going on, and they're not being knocked off course right now by COVID. COVID is not going to change that. One of the other big issues in agriculture is yield gain. It's staying on trend. It's above average. The United States' single biggest problem in agriculture is we're too good for our own good. You know, take anything. You look at yields in almond orchards. You look at yields in cotton. You look at yield in rice. You look at yield in strawberries. And everywhere you look, the yield gain in that crop is significantly higher than population growth, which means we're turning to exports more and more on an ongoing basis. And that yield gain is not going away. I spend a lot of time talking to technology companies and operators. And what happens in agriculture is there's a lot of new technology that comes in, and it takes years to be fully integrated into agricultural practices. Take almond orchards, go back to one of the big crops there in California. There's a lot of older almond orchards out there that could yield higher. And right now, people are making a lot of decisions. You know, should I rip it up and have to wait 6, 7 years to get back to full production? You know, should I leave it be? Well, when you turn over operators, you get different decisions. And consolidation brings the best operators, and they do more. Now, another good thing for agriculture and agribusiness and food manufacturing is the food trends remain unchanged. We're hearing a lot right now during COVID about eating at home and then hoping for recovery and meals away from home on an ongoing basis. But 3 things, whether you're eating at home or eating away, don't change. One is people want ease. People do not like to cook and clean up. So whatever helps them, makes things easy, is going to be a winner. Health. People are more and more focused on the fact that if you don't eat well, you can't have health. And so trends towards providing that health are a big deal. Plus variety. Americans have become incredibly spoiled with the variety we have. You go into a supermarket here in Minnesota in the middle of January, it's 30 degrees below zero outside, and you have fresh fruits and vegetables on those shelves. And we love the variety. So these trends are not getting knocked off by COVID. They might be accelerated. That's one of the things we see during a crisis, things that were going to happen faster. So Stella, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk money. Let's talk money at the farm segment. This is from the USDA's February forecast. Now, obviously, a lot has happened between February and now, and we're going to get a new number from the USDA in August. So what could we expect? So let's look at these numbers for just a second. We're looking for $199 billion of crop revenue in 2020. And that is a good number. It's only slightly below some of the big peaks back in the ethanol run-up and the drought of 2012. Of that $200 billion, $50 billion is in fresh fruits and vegetables, and especially crops like nuts and wine and things like that. And California is the predominant producer in that $50 billion segment. I mean, you do have Florida, Texas, some of the Oregon and Washington. But when it comes to money, California is number one. California has 4 times the ratio of crop to livestock. Well, look at the national number here. Nationally, the two numbers, 199 billion for crop and this estimate 186 billion for livestock and dairy products, it's almost 1-to-1, just to keep it simple. But California has chosen specialty crops. So in California, there's 4 times as much crop revenue as livestock revenue. And that'll be an issue going forward, because if crop revenue is going to be stalled because of competition and exports are going to be the avenue for growth, it might be more difficult. That's an issue to think about as well. Let's flip down and talk about that net farm income, $97 billion. Now, what should we expect? Well, we're going to expect a little bit of a contraction in the crop revenue. I'm not going to expect a whole lot, but maybe they knock it down $5-7 billion. And livestock is recovering, but they have a hole to climb out of. We're seeing that at the beginning of June here, we're seeing kind of almost a complete recovery in production of hogs, cattle, and chickens, but they have a two-month period where it's really, really bad for them. So that would probably push that down as well. But will that necessarily mean that we're going to get weaker net farm income? Probably not. There's an awful lot of money targeted for agriculture right now in the Recovery Act. Now, who gets it? Will it go to livestock? Will it go to crops? Who does it support? That's a really messy political situation. But at the aggregate level, it's going to have a big impact. So that $97 billion of net farm income probably won't contract as much as people might think, given the trouble that we've had already getting COVID through the system. So let's go to the next slide, Stella, if you don't mind. So one of the questions we had on there was the 2 yeses. And I was thinking about this. We've talked to a lot of companies in the last couple of months. And I thought to myself, what do they want when they want to stay in business? One is, do they want to continue business? That's a fair question. Do you want to be in business? Take the restaurant sector. We all know that the restaurant sector has been devastated by the consumer lockdowns and the restrictions put on them. And so if you're a restaurant, family-owned restaurant or small chain, the question is, do you want to continue in business? Were your returns to capital adequate before the crisis? How about returns to labor? Do you think you were getting paid fair for what your effort was? And returns to management, all those other factors. You have to get to a yes there, because if you say no, well, it's the end of the question. You're going to go on to something else. You're going to invest your resources and your talents somewhere else. But if you say yes, then the other question is, can you continue? How much debt and cash flow was there, and can you get the commitment for capital to get there? Another fair question is, what about the next generation of management? That's not the same as ownership, but it could be. But do you have that next generation of management where you're saying, hey, I can continue this business because I have people who can support me? How about the next generation of ownership? Do they think they're getting a fair return? Do they see a better opportunity somewhere else? So do you want to continue business, and can you continue business? So let's go to the next slide here and kind of illustrate this in agriculture. I call this the 42 degrees in Fargo fallacy. Now, in Fargo, North Dakota, I've been there way too often, the average annual temperature of Fargo, North Dakota is 42 degrees. But I assure the people on the line from California that if you dress for 42 degrees in Fargo, North Dakota, 9 months of the year, you'll be really uncomfortable. And 3 other months, you will be dead. It's never 42 degrees in Fargo. So there's an average, but that average really doesn't tell you much about the business. But let's look at this trend. This is from the Risk Management Association. There's about 1,000 businesses participating in here. And so when you look at crop production in the United States over the last 10 years, you can see that we peaked around 2012, 2014. Those were good years in agriculture. We had a drought, we were short, we were catching up, we were still producing more ethanol, we had a weaker dollar during that period of time for better exports. But since 2013-14, we can see there's been a contraction from that 6% profitability range, kind of falling back into the 4% range. And we only have these 10 years of data. I don't have this going back for a longer period of time. So it's hard to say whether this is more normal or less normal. But it does represent that we're seeing that supply growth domestically pressure crop producers, whether you're growing high-end fruits and vegetables or growing commodity crops like corn and soybeans. Everybody's feeling that pressure. And that's pushing back into the suppliers and the input supplies. So let's go to the next slide, Stella, and talk about what do you know and how do you know it. So who's in this database? I said there's about 1,000 operators that are in this database. And one of the things they let us know is where do they fall in terms of asset size? Some are quite small. I mean, in agriculture, $0 to $500,000 of assets. I mean, we see combines that cost more than $500,000 individually, and that's not with all the attachments. So somebody with less than $500,000 in agriculture is a very small operator. You can see most of these operators fall in the category of $2 to $10 million, $10 to $50 million. And my guess is they kind of really cluster closer to that $10 to $20 million. Now, you do have some larger operators. You have operators with $50 to $100 million of assets, and there's certainly going to be a lot more of an impact on the supply. Likewise, you have some really large $100 to $250 million size operators, and they're going to have a big contribution to crop production. Now, anybody over $250 million is not in this database, and we do know there are some operators of that size in there. So let's go to the next slide, Stella, and think about this a little bit. This is what I was alluding to earlier. This is return on assets. In this database for crop production, what they do is they stack rank them. That means they sort them best to worst. And then they tell us what the 25th, the weakest, the median, the middle, and the 75th percentile was each of these given years. So for that individual firm in the database, you take their profits before taxes for that year and divide it by their total assets at the end of the year. And that gives you their return on assets. So we saw that slide earlier about profitability, and you can kind of mirrors what you see in here for return on assets. A little bit stronger and weakening towards the end. That's true of strong players and weak players. But what should strike people is look at the gap. Yeah, you can say on average is a 5% return on assets in agricultural for crop production. But the bottom producers, the weaker producers, they're barely at zero. They're basically churning their accounts. Whereas the stronger producers have 12+% ROAs. Of course they're interested in buying more. Of course they're interested in expanding. Of course they want to get bigger. And the question is, what's driving the difference? And my answer is, it's not the markets. They all face the same input markets for fertilizer, for seed technology, for borrowing costs. They all face the same markets for buying machinery or land. And they all face the same markets for output prices. It has to be the management. It has to be the execution that made the big difference. So let's go to the next slide and talk about a couple of things that are always going to keep these markets churning over. If you see the top of this slide, the title is "The Dosage Makes the Poison." That's an old medical term. In medicine, they point out that anything can be poisonous if you take too much of it. You know, and I tell the joke that, you know, if you have a headache and you take 2 aspirin, your headache goes away. If you have a headache and you take 200 aspirin, you go away. Is it the aspirin's fault? Think about that for debt. So what we have here, once again, is that stack ranking of the participants in the database. And we have the weak, the average, and the strong. And here you take their total debt at end of year when they submitted their documents versus their net worth. And you look at that ratio. And you can say, okay, in agriculture for crop production, most people feel comfortable taking on $2 of debt for every dollar of net worth they have on their balance sheet. The more conservative approach is to take 75 cents of debt for every dollar of net worth. Then you think about the highly leveraged. I mean, you can see the impact of falling profitability and returns on assets. We see that weaker component has gone from a 5 times leverage, which was amazing to start with, to 6 and 7. So any setback, especially here in COVID, and they run out of room in a hurry. They run out of borrowing capacity, and they have a lot more interest debt or interest expense on an ongoing basis. Let's go to the next slide. One last thing and think about. What are you paying yourself? And here's a question that everybody has to think about. This measures what we call owner, director, officer compensation as a percent of sales. And once again, we're stack ranking them. So we're taking those 700, 800 firms that are in the database in the last year, and the 25th percentile are paying themselves 5% of sales. Now, if they're incredibly profitable, maybe that could work. But it's most likely they don't know that they're overpaying themselves, they're overcompensating themselves relative to the competition. The average in crop production is about 2.5 to 3% of sales as compensation for owner, director, officer. And then you have that group, the more probably profitable group actually, because they probably have more sales. Not they don't pay themselves well, but they actually have better returns on assets and other things. They're only paying themselves 1%. Sometimes I call this the Jeff Bezos phenomenon. Jeff Bezos is the world's richest guy, owner of Amazon, founder of Amazon. He once said, and it's kind of a tough statement, that your profits are my opportunity. Well, what's hard for some of the companies in this segment and all segments to understand is if you're paying yourself that much more than your competition, they can come along, buy you out, and use that compensation to repay the debt if it's that far out of balance. And so it really sometimes is a challenge to understand that. And nobody wants to admit they're overcompensated. I don't think I'm overcompensated. I've never met a person who thinks they're overcompensated. The only way to understand that is to actually look at the possible things you're seeing there. So Stella, let's go to the next slide. So their last two questions that went out on the invite is a little bit about where do you go from here with COVID? We've talked about a number of things. And one of the things as an economist I gave up doing is forecasting. Because forecasting, you're going to be wrong. Because when you forecast, you have to give somebody a price and a date. And you're going to be wrong by some degree, by a penny, by a lot. A good example is last Friday. Everybody was wrong. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out and reported that there was 2.5 million more jobs in May than in April, the consensus, which says the herd mentality, had been we were going to lose 8 million jobs. So how could all these brilliant economists, my colleagues, be so wrong? They're off by 10.5 million jobs. That's not a rounding error. That is just an incredibly big difference. So why forecast? Well, people feel they need to, but anticipation, I think, is a better thing. Anticipation talks about that game awareness, you know, the old saying, the old quote from our friend, the hockey player was, Wayne Gretzky was, most people skate to where the puck is, I skate to where the puck is going to be. So question one, is the perfect stopping the good? You know, in COVID, there's been a lot of tough decisions that had to be made. And how much of the delay was dithering, you know? How much of it was, you know you need to do it, but you can't bring yourself to do it? Like my friend from the dairy industry, you know? What information do you really need? How often do people put off a decision because they say, well, with a little bit more information, I could make this decision. But what do you really need? And are they all or nothing bets? It is a lot smoother in our lives if we can avoid all or nothing bets. And then the last point is an old quote. It's also a systems quote. And systems thinking saying is that the adaptable beat the well-adapted in a volatile environment. So when you think about it, if you're perfectly adapted to one type of environment and it changes, you're in trouble. But you have to make yourself adaptable. And that's a mindset as well as anything else. So Stella, why don't we go to the next slide? And at this point, I don't know, are there any questions? People have, I don't know if I've seen any questions submitted. Stella, do you have any questions you want to start with?
Thank you so much, Dr. Swanson. I really appreciated your time that you took today. I really love that you mentioned how spoiled we are. And I don't know if this happened in your part of the world, but a lot of the restaurants in our region were able to adapt pretty quickly and be able to do a lot of carry out. And so I think that we did have an opportunity to, make life easier on ourselves. We were able to order out, have the variety you talked about, and the ease of things. And it also gave us an opportunity to support local businesses as much as possible. And I thought that that was a pretty inspiring thing in our region. And I was just wondering if that was the same kind of mentality in yours as well.
Well, absolutely, yes. We've seen that. I mean, and it's interesting, the execution piece to it. A lot of businesses, a lot of restaurants knew they had to move to a takeout or pickup type situation, but how they executed it has been very, very interesting. I mean, some, and you got to really admire them. I mean, literally, family-owned businesses had to adapt technology on the fly. They had to download an app. They had to sign up for a service so people could order online. So because they didn't have a menu online, and so yes, we saw that here in Minnesota. But it was interesting how quickly, and that's a good example of accelerated adoption. It was going to happen anyways. I have 3 children in their early 20s, and they really, really expect everything to be available via an app. And so a lot of the restaurants that are going to survive will never go back to only being sit down in-store service. They're going to find out they never want to give up that additional revenue stream for that new generation that wants to order and take away. But we did see that. Are there any other questions, or I don't see any, I guess.
I don't see any, but I also want to just comment that it also goes to your last point from your last side about being adaptive, and the quicker that you can adapt to rapid change like that, the more opportunities you're going to have to get past something, like a COVID situation.
Absolutely, and so it goes back to the mixture. I tried to lead off with capital, labor, and management / technology, and I think for the members of this association, that technology piece is it seems obvious, but there's so much to it that I would wonder, well, who's a trusted advisor? Who's a consultant that's not trying to just sell you something that can allow you to accelerate that as well for that adaptability? Because I think there's going to be a lot of adaptability out there if you're open to it, but there's so much, sometimes it's just hard to know what's available.
Awesome. I still don't have any open questions from our attendees. So like we were talking about earlier, like everybody likes to have a little bit more time, right? Let me see here. Okay, well with that, thank you, Dr. Swanson, and thank you, Wells Fargo Bank, for being outstanding technical advisors for the Family Business Center. And if you're a guest on this webinar and you're interested in more information about membership, you can click on or you can type in capfamilybus.org. And like I said, this presentation is being recorded, so I'll be sending out an email shortly with this handout, and as well as the resource section, and the video of this, the recording of this will be available tomorrow afternoon. Up next, we have Leadership in the Times of Fear and Uncertainty. This is going to be a workshop. It's from Robert Scheer, from CEO to CEO. It's going to be on June the 24th. There's a typo here. It's from 2 to 3:30 p.m. And it's not going to be a typical webinar. It's going to be a workshop. So I hope that you come back and join us then too. With that, thank you. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person at one of our upcoming Generations conferences. So
Well, thank you.
that's it. Thank you.